Hey guys, for this fourth part of our discussion on the church, I'm wanting to cover specifically what church government looks like. So far, we've talked about the church in general, how the global church is one body of Christ, but specifically how God has called us into fellowship in the local body of Christ. And so we're covering a couple of issues that about your local church that will differ depending on which local body of Christ in the city of Colorado Springs or even across the world will look like. And so I just got off of a Zoom call with a couple of our churches working on going to Ireland as missionaries, and we were speaking with people involved in a local church in Cork, Ireland, where we're hoping to send John and Nicole Gillen. But also on that call, there was not only were there people from Ireland there, but people from a church in Kiev, Ukraine, missionaries there and school teachers there. And that we're all talking about getting John and Nicole going. And so as we look at that, each of these different bodies of Christ have different ways of looking at things. And some are based on tradition, some are based on the scriptures, some are based on the country you live in, just to be really honest. And then we'll talk about some of that as we go. So I'm sitting here in our board room. This is where we have most of our, and I'm making the camera shake, but this is where we have most of our board meetings and staff meetings as a church as well. Behind me on this side, you see the calendar of the months of March and April that we need to move on till May, I guess. And then we have over here a board with brainstorming and our priorities and hookups for conference calls and just stuff like that. So that's why I'm in this room. So today's lecture is going to specifically talk about the governance or the structure of your church. And so if you want to make sure that you have part 4 of your notes that look like this for the lecture 4, if you don't have those, pause and go get those. I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to jump in then to this lecture. This part of the lecture is very specifically on the way that we organize our church and across the world, common practices in the organization of the church. And so let's just dive into this. The Old Testament spends multiple chapters describing the structure of the Jewish worship. You have this on your sheet in minute detail, and you'll remember in our discussions of Exodus and Leviticus, where and even into Numbers, but where God gave a very distinct, succinct, not to be tampered with order of structure for the Jewish people. As the New Testament, in the New Testament, then there's just a handful of scattered references to what church government might look like, what worship in the church might look like, and that sort of thing. So I want to give you today's just some examples of what structures have developed in the church over the last 2,000 years, the last 2 millennia, and what they generally look like. But really, when we get to each body, you have to, again, with some of these other areas, what denomination do we belong in? Or if we're not a denominational church, then how is our church structured themselves? And I'll interact again based on what our church has decided. And I happen to be the elder that's kind of behind some of that structure, and that's how I think. So we'll express a little bit of that as well. But I want you to be aware of how your church is structured, with the governance or the leadership organization of your church is like and what it looks like. So I think it's very, very important as you move forward to understand how things work. But also because, and as we begin to talk about spiritual gifts and the like, where do you fit into your local church with your gifts and the talents and abilities that God has given you? What kind of church structure and format fits your giftings best? And then where is it that you can fit it, and who do you go to in your church? So let's begin to take a look at some of these things. The first type of church structure that we're going to look at is called an Episcopal structure of governance. And there is a denomination that refers to this, but it's bigger than that. The idea of the Episcopal governance is that the church is governed by bishops who are accountable to higher ranking bishops as we go. And so these bishops, which comes from the New Testament word for overseer, episkopos, which is used in Acts chapter 1 Timothy 3, it's used in Titus 1. It's a word that sometimes is translated as bishop or overseer, but also many, many times as elder. And it's the word episkopos, and it's this idea of a bishop. And it's a hierarchy of bishops, and you start with the top bishop, and like you would like the Pope, or the Archbishop of Canterbury, or the Metropolitan or Patriarch of Constantinople. And then there's a hierarchy of bishops underneath this individual. Those three I just mentioned would be the top bishop in the Roman Catholic Church, the top bishop in the Anglican Church, the top bishop in Orthodoxy. And so the idea is a ranking of bishops. So examples of these churches are like ones I've just mentioned. The Catholic Church, and the top bishop would be Pope John, or Pope, I'm a couple years old, Pope Francis, there, and he lives in Vatican City in the middle of Rome. And he has a variety of bishops. In Colorado, the Archbishop is in Denver, and we're in the Archbishopric of Denver. And then in the Diocese of Colorado Springs, which covers a good portion of central Colorado. Then our bishop here, or the bishop here, is Bishop Sheridan. And the main church is St. Mary's Cathedral downtown. The Eastern and Orthodox churches, the bishop, or they usually call him a patriarch or a metropolitan, is usually seated in Constantinople, which used to be the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, then the Byzantine Empire, and now of Turkey, or it's the main city in Turkey. Very, very few Christians there because Islam has taken over. But there's a little niche there where that kind of is, they call it a first among equals of all the bishops. And there's Anglican churches that will have bishops, and the Anglican communion is pretty big across the world as well. In America, it tends to be called the Episcopalian Church, but they're just a branch of the Anglican Church. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, and his name escapes me right now, but he is basically the head of the Anglican Church as far as the operations of the church go. And then there's a number of Methodist or African American Pentecostal churches that have a hierarchy of bishops as well, but not quite as structured and organized in exactly the same way as the Catholic or Anglican churches are probably the two most distinct on that area that would follow that kind of model. Then there's a model called the connexio model, and it's a derivative of the Episcopal model or polity, which combines a loose Episcopal hierarchy. So there's a kind of a hierarchy of some bishops and stuff, but with a bottom structure that's very centered on the local congregation, and they're called circuits. Instead of parishes or dioceses, they're called circuits. And most of your Methodist churches operate in this kind of structure where there is a hierarchy of bishops. There's a council of bishops that governs the Methodist Church nationally and worldwide. But as you get down to the local Methodist Church, First United Methodist Church downtown, Sunrise Methodist Church up on a Wooden Road here, Wilson Methodist Church up in the Mountain Shadows area, but their local congregation has a lot more say in their governance and stuff like that. So they're connected, a connexional format there of connection. So they're related. It's a little bit hierarchical, but very much more focused on the local. I'm going to go back to that real quick. Your Southern Baptist might be, even your Evangelical Lutheran, there's a couple of Lutheran branches, would act maybe a little bit more like this connexio than other denominations. Assemblies of God might as well, where there's a central headquarters. Your Presbyterian model, and again, this is more than just the Presbyterian Church or one of the specifically denominations that have this name in it, but it really is a lot of our Reformed churches, Presbyterian, Reformed, and there's a lot of national Reformed churches, follow this Presbyterian model. And this also comes from the New Testament. The word presbytery is this council of elders or presbyters that you see in the New Testament, which is referred to in Timothy 4. It's referred to in Acts 11 at the very end of verse, I think it's 28 or 30, where the church at Antioch sends a gift of money to help to the elders or the presbytery of the Church of Jerusalem. And so you'll see this word used throughout the New Testament in the Greek, then often translated as elders in our modern English translations. And so most of our Reformed, so this is where there's a council that governs the churches, both from your local church. There's a council of elders or presbyters, and then there's, if I understand it correctly, there tend to be regional presbyteries that govern a region within a Presbyterian denomination, and so on. or reformed, like reformed denomination like Craigmore Christian Reformed is one that has a number of people at our school. The Episcopalian Church, so really part of the Anglican communion, we call it, or denomination. The American church branch of that, the Episcopalians, tend to actually operate a little bit more in a Presbyterian format than they do in the Episcopal format, even though they're part of that greater Episcopalian or greater Anglican governance. Now, what you're going to see, and we're going to move on to this in just a second, but you're going to see in America particularly that there tends to be kind of a blending of things. And so we talk in America a lot about denominations. You'll have your Assemblies of God, you'll have your Southern Baptist Convention, you'll have your I think it's Evangelical Lutheran Missouri Synod or something, and I may have messed that up, and I apologize to those of you that are Lutheran. But America has a lot of denominations in it. There's a whole variety of Baptists, North American Baptist and Southern Baptist and Northern. And I've got a couple of friends that are pastors in a couple of different those kinds of Baptist churches, or Southern Methodist and Northern Methodist, United Methodist, Free Methodist, and so we do have a lot of denominations that are kind of a mixture of the Episcopal Presbyterian model as you look at how they're governed. But with each of these models, you tend to end up with a group above you or an individual above you that sets policy, that sets your kind of common statement of faith. So a number of you, as you have turned in your statements of faith or made comments about your statement of faith, have referred to, well, our denomination says this, or the Council of Bishops say that, or the Pope says this, and so you'll find that they tend to pass down then your statements of belief, and it's the local governance that is really both been kind of an American thing as our country has grown. Again, structures don't always follow churches until they're well established, and so they haven't always developed with denominations. Colorado Springs is a very non-denominational town. You will still find Presbyterian USA or Evangelical Presbyterian churches or Roman Catholic churches or a variety of the Lutheran churches. But most of our churches in Colorado Springs and most of our large churches in Colorado Springs tend to be non-denominational, which means they're not attached to a hierarchy of any kind, Presbyterian or conaxial or Episcopal. And so the next thing I want to get to is actually more of an American invention, where we do see denominations. Lutheran churches tend to be Northern European. Catholic churches tend to be made up of, not always, but kind of Southern Europe or Hispanic, not always. And so they tend to go with nationalities, but not consistently. Craigmore Christian Reformed is a Dutch Reformed church, and you'll see that there's different brands of that, but they tend to fall in general camps, kind of based on nationality. In America, that really blends because we're a blend of nationalities. The congregational really is an Americanish invention, and just the way that it's ruled is a very American way of doing it. And I'm talking about the influence and not necessarily expressing at this point an opinion on that. But the idea of the congregational church is that it's local. The local congregation rules itself, independent of a higher denomination. They elect their own leaders. They ordain their own clergy rather than have them appointed by a hierarchy. In order to be a priest in Colorado Springs, then you have the bishop of the Colorado Springs diocese, you have the archbishop in Denver, you have even the Pope to the Vatican. I don't know if the Pope is involved in the details of who the bishop of your parish is, but there's a denomination-wide involvement in that. I was on a missions trip down to the San Luis Valley in the little town of Antonito, and just an amazing old man of God. He was in his 80s, and the Assemblies of God denomination called him out of retirement, saying, we are in desperate need of a pastor in Antonito, Colorado, because there's nobody there. And so the denomination is busy, is really involved in planting pastors and churches, not with the congregational. It's very locally oriented. Notice the idea of electing your own leaders. Local rule, electing leaders, very much an American idea from the very beginning. Congregational churches started out of the Puritans in the early days, the founding of our not even before our country, way before that, Plymouth Rock, Massachusetts colony, and they formed these congregations that operated in this way. So you have, they are basically electing their leaders, and kind of creating their own policy and hierarchy. And so you'll see this, even though you might not be part of the congregational denomination, because there is a denomination there, you see this idea now infused in a lot of our churches that are very local run. You elect your leaders; they're not appointed by some higher authority, and so that's very much become what we do. So here's some other terms then that you might also hear. This is probably less clear than the baptism and the communion that we've already talked about. Some other terms that you would see regarding church government is this idea of plurality, where a local church makes decisions by committee. Usually that committee is a group of elders. And so this could be very similar to the Presbyterian model, where you have this group of elders, this council of presbyters or elders. And so it's a local body governed by elders. It also probably also pulls from the congregational, that they're locally governed and there's not a hierarchy of those elders. There's also, in contrast to that then, is this idea of singularity, where decisions are made by the denomination coming from above or by one pastor. And that pastor runs the church like a CEO would run a local business. And you might have a board of directors. Sometimes they're called elders or deacons, just to put a biblical term on that. But really, you hire a CEO pastor, and he runs the church like a dictator or CEO of an organization or whatever. And you see that a lot in a lot of our local churches. And again, they pull in a lot of that local control idea from Congregationalism, sometimes assigned from above, but not always. And so when you get to the local body, is your church run by one man, by a pastor? Is it ruled by and governed and shepherded by then a plurality? So what we do here at our church, just to kind of give you, so we're kind of a hodgepodge. We're a church that has Pentecostal charismatic roots in it, but and we come from a tradition of very strong one-man pastor, preacher, CEO. Whatever he says goes. Everybody just scrambles and does it. And we have really intentionally struggled out of that model, and it's hard to, because that's very much, again, it's not just even American, but we do tend to look to one person to do that. So we have tried to move more to a plurality, where we have a group of elders. We have 7 of us that right now that meet in this room. Right now we meet once a week in this current crisis. We usually meet every other week, and we make the decisions of the church. So we govern, but we also shepherd. We're also in charge of various aspects of caring for the souls of the church. I'm over the areas of youth and missions, and so my job is to oversee our youth pastors and work with our missionaries. Just got off that call with missionaries this morning, and so my job is to pastor or shepherd those 2 groups, and then others do young adults, or will do the men or the women in the church, or that sort of thing. So we operate on a local control. We're not accountable to a higher body. Plurality. We do have a lead pastor. He's employed, and he does a lot of the day in and day out and shares vision. But we also have a staff supervising pastor, and just different things like that. So that's how we have put it together at our church. New Life and Woodman both have exemplary models of how you do church, and they, like us, are locally controlled, and they, like us, have elders. I think their elders maybe operate in a different role or capacity. They're also both for a lot bigger churches, and those in Mountain Springs. Similar ideas that we operate under here, but we're all different kind of expressions of the body of Christ here on the north end of Colorado Springs. So what I want you to do in your notes is to take some time and to talk to your parents, or if you get a chance, talk to your youth pastor or somebody, your pastor, and look at your statement of faith and see what kind of, or discern as much as you can, what kind of leaders does your church have? How is your church structured? What are the titles that are given at your church? And so just take a moment to do that. Right at the bottom of that page there, you'll see a place about your church. What is your church like, and what does your church do? And so take some time to do that. And then we're done with this lecture for the day. There's one more to go, and so just save these notes. And then after that, you can upload all of them into Moodle. All right, thank you so very much. Go ahead and process your church. Make sure you get all those notes filled in, and then we're done for the day. Thank you.